Okay, so as Brooke mentioned, we brought you into the table so that we can start working on writing up some messages, but to guide that we need to just quickly touch base with the important role of audience in driving message. Brooke's work around social media and the different roles people play in social media started that conversation, but I guess some of the key things here, this is, it's really easy when you're thinking about audiences to have this massive list, but half of the challenge is we do tend to put out one message, one primary message, and hope, I use the term the spray and pray approach, we're just going to spray and we hope everybody gets it in the way that we want them to get it. And although there is opportunities to tailor that message in certain ways through different channels, it's useful to think about what you can do with audience around this. And I guess some of the things we wanted to talk about is the sensitivity of the issues, and in part thinking about kids and communicating in that kind of context is really key. Are you talking about a geographic region where there's a high turnover, so there's a change in the tourist area, or it's quite a mobile workplace or workforce that's focusing in that area? So you're needing to be cognizant of those kinds of things because those community members don't have the residual knowledge that we might need to keep in mind. Thinking about migrants, is it a newly created area for migrants or an encouraged area, and how will those kinds of culturally and linguistically diverse communities need to be considered here? Is this a region where people with a higher socioeconomic status are in play, and so there tends to be good kind of understanding of scientific knowledge, and so the information need or want from them is different to other areas? So the details are important to those kinds of audiences, and exposure to media coverage. I guess being an educator, I see this all the time, assuming that our young adults know what I'm talking about when I talk about, different companies or events, and they're just kind of like, what? So is it a community that has that constant access to media and understands and digests that kind of information, or do we need to think about what channels are more beneficial to particular areas? So this is from some research similar to the information sources I showed you, where we asked community members to identify or self-report their current knowledge, the information need, their confidence to adequately deal with flooding, the worry they associate with flooding, likelihood of risk and seriousness of risk. So these two map together to form a risk perception assessment. We asked the community members to rate all of this, and it's really interesting. You have the results also for bushfire as well, that while there's a high current knowledge, there's also a high information need. And so the questions are, what kind of, how would you rate your need for information to make decisions about responding to a flood, etc.
Was this in Queensland?
This was a national sample, yeah, a national sample. So one of the things we know from research is that community understanding of a hazard knowledge about its characteristics, is a really important driver to decisions and protective action. So that current knowledge is rated as quite high as good, but that information need is rated as quite high, means that they need to fill that gap when they're responding, and in part we need to fill that gap. And I guess we wanted to ask you, what kind of information do you find that the community needs when you're maybe looking back through social media or I guess evaluating events that have occurred? What are the information you needs that the community identify to you? So I guess these are some kind of inputs that you could think about as you're framing messages, that there is the need to rebalance some of the knowledge and information need. Confidence to adequately deal with events is quite high, but for some members of the community it's not there. So how do you offset or balance that a little bit? And worries has a little bit of a mixed pattern here. For bushfires, I guess, well, there we go. Yeah, the risk perception side of this was higher, largely because we went to rural areas with our national samples, so we did get those that are more bushfire prone. So thinking about hazard knowledge as a seeder for elements in message design, we wanted to share with you some of the key elements of messages. So these are kinds of ways of crafting a message that might help address some of the issues that exist within the community, as well as be more effective. So direct statements we saw a lot of in the Theresa May response, and we use a lot of it already in messaging. You know, this is a direct instruction, a direct piece of information about what we want you to do, quite fact-based information. Elucidating explanations are where you have a term that might be a little bit, that we might need to provide more clarity over. And the one that always pops to mind for me is catchments. I don't know, maybe I'm biased. I've been primed, having done some research with SEQ water. You know, the community have really different understandings of what catchments mean. They don't know it. It's not an easy part of our dialogue, but they do make good attempts at guessing what it is. But to provide more elucidating statements, you would say, this is what a catchment is, this is not what a catchment is. So, you know, you provide both sides of the coins there. Quasi-scientific messages is when you are dealing with that data, and I think, Peter, you made the point of, at the Bureau, you'd love to be able to say, hey, I'm looking at science, and here is the data that drives the decisions that I make. So sometimes the challenge comes in translating what that science is, and so one of the ways to do that is through visuals, or actually breaking down the life cycle of a cyclone, or here's what a heat wave looks like, etc. So how can we use pictures or metaphors to better capture that, the process? And transformative text or explanations occurs when we see lay people making assumptions about, or having incorrect rumours or facts about what something is and what something is not. And so we tend to want to use transformative text to say, acknowledge that there is misinformation out there, and then provide some further information to counter that. So we've seen it with the myth-busting kind of campaigns that ran through around the floods. So you want to show an alternative, correct pathway to counterbalance some of the fact that's there. So controlled burning, I guess, is one of the issues that sometimes the community think, well, why are you doing controlled burning? I mean, you're still putting a fire near me, etc., but the rationale for that is X, Y, and Z. This is a campaign that Brooke shared around Ebola in the US, and we were trying to we were talking to see if we could find an Australian equivalent, but I don't think we had really that much. It wasn't a bigger threat for us here, so we didn't really have cases, not that I could recall off the top of my head anyway. But this is, did I put the examples in? Yeah. So an example about a direct statement, we're giving you some facts about Ebola, and then an elucidating statement. So if there is an assumption, so this message says you can't get Ebola through air. If there's an assumption that, you know, about how Ebola is transmitted, just correcting that. And then transformative text, you can't get Ebola through food grown or legally purchased in the US. So
you probably push back anyway when people say, oh, that's only happened with government's conspiracy. So people tend to look at facts and things that back up their own prejudice in some respects, don't they?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, if you are going to distrust the government, then you can't really help people like that, in my opinion. Did I say that on video? Hi, personal opinion.
Well, some people in general dislike it.
Yeah, well, yes. But yeah, I mean, I think this is a challenge. We all aim for a 100% compliance, but it's never going to happen. People are people. So, but this is a way of, I guess, fact-checking and myth-busting if there are some positions out there about how transmittable Ebola could be, for example.
Just think back to that first one where you run the risk of that one. Mosquito bit, but it doesn't identify which diseases mosquitoes
carry.
So.
Yeah, that's a good point. So I'm going to throw to Brooke now, but I guess as we work to the exercise, just keep in mind some of those different message statement options that you would have.
So in the States right now, and what I've heard from some of you today too, we're really interested in the quasi-scientific messages. So how do we communicate risk visually with the rise of visual social media, as well as infographics. Maybe that's a way to be more persuasive. So we did a study for the Department of Homeland Security that took the standard wireless emergency alerts, WEAs. Those are those ones everyone gets on their phone unless you opt out, but you have to do that in a very complex way. And we tested the standard message. Could be something like tornado warning in this area until 6:30 p.m., take shelter, check local media, NWS for our bureau, National Weather Service. So we took the standard message that actually goes out, and then we added a map to it and see if people could see where they were on the map in comparison to the risk, whether that would help them understand the science more. Would that type of quasi-scientific message work out better? Slightly, but not as much as we had hoped. And so we found that actually compliance to the message was not driven by the visual, but whether people felt fear. So whether those emotions were primed, so whether they were scared, essentially this could be something bad, that primed it more than the actual message or the visual. Whether they had any clarity and understanding, so people's map literacy appears to be quite low in the US. So are they able to process the visual message? And if they are, there was a better understanding of the risk, as you would expect. However, across the total sample of adults in the US, there was actually a small negative effect on the maps. So it lowered people's intentions to whether it was shelter in place. We looked at, you can see the hazards up there, active shooter, tsunami, or radiological detonations. So some were shelter in place, some were evacuate. But actually seeing the map was too confusing, essentially, and people were not able to process it. And so the US government is still playing around with this. They just changed the WEAs, and so they actually are going to be map enabled moving forward. So they didn't want to just stop with the study and move forward. But we're still trying to figure this out. And so we don't really have a lot of science to know when to use a visual, when not to, how to make the visual more appealing so it actually works. And so that's something that's a gap. What have you guys just found from your practical experience when you're trying to use these quasi-scientific messages? So putting science into visuals, essentially. What have you seen works versus doesn't work, like our MAPS experiment? So switching gears slightly, but kind of going back to what Amisha was talking about in terms of knowing your audience. So at least in the US, we take a one-size-fits-all to our warning messages, which I think is obviously highly problematic because there are very different audiences. And so this is a study we just completed this summer, funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they're in year 3 of funding at least 5 or 6 years of research on tornado communication in the southeast US. So with Tiger-Nado, I told you that was the Midwest Tornado Alley. Southeast is not where we typically get a lot of tornadoes. However, we had the huge storm in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where it pretty much wiped out that university town. And from that, there was kind of a need to think about these high-risk communities. So when you look at the data, only 25% of the tornadoes, on average, that hit the US hit this part of the country. However, we have the most fatalities in the southeast, for a variety of factors. Some of them are they have a lot more killer tornadoes there, so higher impact tornadoes. They also happen to happen at night, and so people are sleeping, might not get your message, or they don't want to get out of bed and get dressed and do something about it, and they're harder to predict. It's harder to warn when you can't see it, and it's going through forests. So Southeast has a lot of forests, Midwest is open plains. So there's some prediction challenges here, but there's also some challenges in the community that they're not as well informed about tornado communication, and there's a very low socioeconomic status community in these areas. So we call them mobile home communities. I think you call them caravan communities here, but there are very large penetration of mobile home communities in this area as well. That's a problem because the only single official warning message is shelter in place, which is the exact opposite thing you should be doing if you live in a caravan community. So and then to put the icing on the cake, you have about 13 minutes from warning to tornado touchdown. So this is a really high challenge. So we did 4 surveys with about 4,000 folks in the southeast, so across the entire southeast. And we did focus groups in 3 cities with 77 people to figure out what information do they want? How could the government better warn? And what about these differences among audiences? So we focused on mobile home, caravan communities, as well as the general population. So here's an infographic that is hard for you to see on the screen, but highlights some of the focus group findings. And probably the most interesting one, surprising for us, was the role of religion. Now you're going to say to me, no duh, this is the Bible Belt. But going in, no one was thinking about faith-based communication and how that might be a way to motivate people's protective action taking, not from the government, obviously, given our separation of church and state, but thinking about those community partners and who are the people that you might be wanting to see. And we did actually see in our survey that the primary protective action people in caravan communities took was prayer. So they felt like they were going to die and they couldn't do anything, so they were going to put it in God's hands. And so thinking about your preparedness communication, getting those communities involved, and maybe helping them think about what neighbors, whose homes could they go to during the watch? Because we do have that pre-warning communication and not wait for the warning. We saw a lot of people looking at environmental cues. That's the leaf in the corner. They wanted to see the twister before they took action, or they want to see how their animals responded. So if the cows were lying down, or if your dog was lying down, there's some urban legend that means it's really coming. And so doing some education about actually you should listen to the meteorologist instead of the cow. That might get you a little bit further in terms of information. We saw the same thing with our terrorism study. People looked at families and friends before going to official warning. But with the huge exception of their broadcast meteorologists. And there are just some beautiful quotes. They tell you no one can predict the weather better than James Spann, he's better than God. So there's these beautiful quotes about these broadcast meteorologists they have a real bond with. And they think they're a lot more accurate than the National Weather Service, and they trust them more. And so that is a real path forward, is working with those meteorologists, as well as trying to increase some trust in the National Weather Service. So what we saw from our survey, kind of the key findings from that, I already told you that people aren't seeking shelter. Indeed, not a single person in our 4,000 person sample was seeking shelter outside of the home. So that's a huge problem. There are not community shelters, so they need to rely on churches or friends in other places. Yeah, absolutely. So we can take the obvious conclusion there. Protective actions are not well communicated or not communicated at all in that case. We also saw less information access from our mobile home community members. So they were literally using less sources to find information about tornadoes. Very sadly, some of these mobile homes are built so the NOAA weather radio doesn't work. So that's one of those kind of, you hear the sound. We have these radios where the siren goes off if there's an event. Unfortunately, with the metal in the homes, that doesn't work for a lot of these communities. They might not have the mobile phone, so they're not getting the WIA, and it's the middle of the night, so they don't have the broadcast TV turned on. So that's a real challenge. Not a huge reliance on social media. Again, those local meteorologists are like God. We have this great picture from Facebook where local schools are building cakes to look like the local weatherman. They have a cake for the community to have it look like the local weatherman. So the really huge trust there. And then religiosity predicting people's protective actions, as well as some emotional coping. So anxiety and anger predicted, but sadness and confusion did not. So pretend like you're me, and what recommendations would you give? Then how can government people in this region of the country better communicate warning communities? We already turned in our final report, but if you had this data, what would be your recommendations? How can they more effectively reach people in the Southeast? So the next step for my research team is we've got almost final approval. We're going to be observing meteorologists at the National Weather Service. We're actually going to go live with them and in their labs and during tornado season and see how they make decisions, how they decide to warn, what risk communication choices they make, how they develop community partnerships, and we're doing that over the course of 2 years. So we're going to flip it away from the public and go to the meteorologists, and there's been no prior research on that in the US. So everyone studies broadcast meteorologists, but no one's actually studied the official meteorologists that develop the warnings everyone else reports on. So we're really excited to see what we find from that and hopefully how we can influence the message from the onset as opposed to after it goes out. So now I want to walk you very briefly through, I think, a really intuitive tool, but a lot of US agencies use this as a way to guide their message development. How many of you guys have done message mapping before? Okay, I'm getting 2 yes, 3 yeses. 4 5 yeses. Okay. So the idea here is you think about who your intended audience or audiences are, internal audiences, external audiences, then breaking it down even more to maybe those caravan communities versus others. You think about what your intended media channel is. So of course, you're going to craft a message quite differently if it's a 90-character tweet, a 280-character Facebook post, or one of your beautiful multi-page official warnings. So thinking about the channel. And you might have different messages for different channels. We're thinking about complementing the information we send out. You might have a core message, but you emphasize different things for different channels to get kind of that message redundancy and persuade people more to take action. When you're thinking about what your message is, first you want to figure out what problem you're trying to solve. So what's your question? What's your concern? What's the topic that you're trying to address in your message? And then you want to pick your spokesperson. Is it Theresa May because she's powerful for terrorism? Is it multi-spokespeople? But who's going to be the most effective spokesperson or message source if you're posting it online? Will this come from our official social media channel? Will it come from people's personal social media channels? What's going to be the most effective source? And we generally think of you having 3 thereabouts key messages. There was a widely supported psychological study that just got debunked a couple months ago, but there was this kind of assumption that people can't process more than 3 messages during times of stress. That's been debunked, but you can still use as a rule of thumb, don't give people 10 messages. So think about it fairly in a concise and consistency across messages. So what's your key message? What are your facts to support that message? It doesn't have to be 3 supporting facts, but you got the message, now give them the evidence to believe that message. And then you think about if you have a second key message, what are the facts? If you have a third or fourth key message, what are your facts? Then when you're delivering this message, if you're doing it orally like we saw with Theresa May, you want to express empathy or caring, straight the key message, facts. Key message, facts. Now we did discuss how she went kind of over the board, and some of you thought that was great, and some of you thought it wasn't so great. And we're going to see that with any message, right? Not everyone's going to love a message. But one way to think about it is, what's the key message? What are the supporting? And then going back and forth. You can also, if you have supporting facts that support more than one message, you can bridge them together as well. You want to repeat your key messages at the end, so people remember what you think is the most important thing at the end, especially for a really long press conference statement. People are probably not gonna, you guys didn't YouTube that, right? I think I saw one hand say, oh yeah, I looked that up. It's, unless you're maybe forced to listen to the whole thing, you might listen to the beginning or the end. And so you want to repeat those messages and indicate the next steps, both what are you doing as an agency and what do you want people to do if you want them to do something. So you got your map, and then you think about how you're going to express this either in a press conference or you could do the same thing with social media. That was relatively quick, but did it make sense? Enough sense for you guys to do this? Okay. So recall your event before, unless you want to change it, but for timing, maybe keep your crazy cyber attack or your floods and the heat that you guys picked. We're having you developing a Facebook post or an emergency alert, 160 characters. Okay, so we get 90 in the US, you guys get 160 for your emergency alert, so you should feel really blessed. Facebook posts typically are about 280 characters, is what research shows tend to be effective. You don't have to sit there and count it, just think about that general length. So you guys talked about your message objectives before. Now you're gonna use the map. That's the problem you're solving, that's your objective, and develop a message for Facebook based upon your intended audience, and then do it for your emergency alert.